Good evening. Welcome to St. Peter's in Hove. I'm Father Alexander, and we're here to talk about Jeremiah chapter 9, our 263rd step in our walking tour through the Bible. And goodness, Jeremiah, we're going to be with him for some time because he's quite a long prophet. He goes on for over 50 chapters. Well, I suppose we're 20% the way through almost, but I think one must try and like him. Even though he does go off on one, he's unremittingly negative. Well, here he is, chapter 9, saying, "Who will find me a wayfarer's shelter in the desert, for me to quit my people and leave them far behind?" A rather poetic little image. He's saying, I want to go off into the desert. I want to sit in a hut, a wayfarer's shelter, sort of like a bus shelter is what I think of it. Well, this immediately brings to mind that other misanthrope, namely the prophet Jonah. Now, the prophet Jonah post-dates Jeremiah. So I think the writer of the prophet Jonah probably had this in mind, where if you remember, Jonah leaves the city of Nineveh to its fate and goes and sits out in the hot sun, and then he's sheltered by a castor oil plant. So Jonah goes off. He's a misanthrope. He hates humanity. And here too, I think Jeremiah sounds like somebody who's really lost it with humanity. Why? Well, for all of them are adulterers, he says, a conspiracy of traitors. They bend their tongues like a bow. Not truth but falsehood holds sway in the land. Yes, they go from crime to crime, but me they do not know, Yahweh the Lord declares. Let each be on guard against his friend. Do not trust a brother, for every brother aims but to supplant, and every friend is a peddler of slander. Each one cheats his friend, never telling the truth. They have trained their tongues to lie and devote all their energies to doing wrong. You live in a world of bad faith. Now, what's he talking about here? Well, he's saying they're all adulterers. They've made marriage vows, but they've broken them. They're all liars. Their tongues are twisted. Their tongues bend like bows. Each man needs to be on guard, not just against his enemies, but against his friends, because nobody can be trusted. Everybody is a liar. Everybody is a peddler of slander. In other words, you live in the world of bad faith. The whole city of Jerusalem has become a hellscape where nobody can be trusted. Now, this is very serious. All social relations depend on truth. All social relations depend on us speaking to each other in a common language where we all admit that the words we use mean the same things. So when somebody says to you, I will honor your contract, and then they say, oh, well, when I said I'd honor your contract, I didn't really mean in that way that you assume I meant, you'd be very disappointed. In other words, if a man's word is not his bond, there are no ties that bind, there are no bonds. And if there are no bonds, there's no society, there's no city. What is a city except a gathering of people who come together for their mutual advantage, and a group of people who communicate with each other in a common language with a common set of values underpinning that language? This is the thing that Aristotle talks about when he talks about the city-state being the ideal place. It's a place where radical dissent is excluded. I borrow that idea from the great and good philosopher Alistair MacIntyre. Why is radical dissent excluded? Because radical dissent, a bit like the infantilism of very small children, cannot be incorporated into the single body because it refuses to acknowledge the shared authority of the shared language. It wants to speak its own language. And here, everybody is descending from everybody else. It's collapsed. That's why God then goes on to say that the entire city is going to be destroyed. And here we have it in verse 10. I raise the wail and lament for the mountains and dirge for the desert pastures, for they've been burnt, no one passes there. The sound of flocks is heard no more, etc. I shall make Jerusalem a heap of ruins, he says, a lair for jackals, and the towns of Judah an uninhabited wasteland. In other words, what is destroying Jerusalem is not actually God, it's the people in it who are destroying Jerusalem by their lack of shared values, their lack of a shared language, their lack of trust for each other. Okay, Jeremiah then is quite right to call out the lies of Jerusalem. He's quite right to condemn lying, because lying attacks the very basis of society. We can't trust anybody. How can we live with them? And you know this is true. When your wife, husband lies to you, they kill the marriage, don't they? When a friend lies to you, they kill the relationship. When your boss lies to you, it's devastating, isn't it? It's all happened to us, hasn't it? When they tell you something completely untrue, which you know is untrue, and they know that you know it's untrue. It destroys, and you want to go and get another job after that. We've all been there. So what this goes to is the lie is deadly. The lie kills society. The lie kills civilization. The lie kills the civitas. The lie kills the city. The lie is that which is damaging the church and also damaging society as a whole. One of the things we hear about constantly nowadays is society of false news or fake news, but also much more worrying than the conspiracy theories and the nuttiness that circulates on social media and on the internet and even in newspapers. Much worse than this is the idea that the thing is what I want it to be, not what it's always been assumed to be. In other words, there's no objectivity whatsoever. Everything is subjective. Now, if everything is subjective, you and I can never, ever communicate. Because when I say something like truth matters, you say something like, well, it all depends what you mean by the truth. Truth is something that exists purely in your head. There's no such thing as objective truth. Well, when everything is reduced to that, there can be no more conversations. There used to be a time when we said words and they were univocal. Univocal. That's to say, they meant one thing and one thing only. I said, that's a man, that's a woman, that's a child, that's an old person, etc. Now, a woman is whoever declares himself to be a woman, according to the Scottish Parliament. A man is whoever declares himself to be a man, according to the Scottish Parliament. How that works out in practice is not particularly interesting, although it can be quite dramatic at times. What's really worrying about that for all Christians is the attack it represents on the idea of objective truth. Because if a thing is what we want it to be rather than what it is, then we can't really talk about God. God is the ultimate reality. He's more than something that exists as an idea in my head. God is a real person. But if people then say, oh, well, it's just you saying that, there is no objective reality, then we can't really talk about God. We can't talk about, certainly can't talk about revelation. It's a bit worrying when the truths of biology are destroyed because all other truths tend to collapse a bit like a house of cards. We can't really talk about anything else. Jesus Christ is, of course, the ultimate revelation of God, but there are other proximate truths that depend, that are necessary for us to be able to believe in the truth of the incarnation. Anyway, Jeremiah finishes off his chapter with verse 22. The Lord says this, let the sage not boast of wisdom, nor the valiant of valor, nor the wealthy of riches. But let anyone who wants to boast of this, of understanding and knowing me. For I am the Lord who acts with faithful love, justice, and uprightness on earth. Yes, these are what pleases me, the Lord declares. The final basis of truth is the knowledge of God. So we need to seek God. And the more we seek God, the more we'll be able to get away from the nonsense and the lies that we tell ourselves. You can tell yourself all sorts of lies. You can tell yourself that what you think is true must be true, or what you want to be true is true. You can go down that Nietzschean path of declaring that the will is the only arbiter. If I say it's true, it must be true. If I will it to be true, it must be true. But when you go into church and sit down in the presence of God, can you really say that? Doesn't God call you into question? Doesn't God make you realize that you could be wrong? Perhaps. We need to turn to God. How right that rather misanthropic Jeremiah is. All the best. Bye.